Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. The difficulties of life under military occupation and a pandemic for the people of Kashmir.
The COVID-19 pandemic has upended lives of people all over the world. The sense of powerlessness, the fear of infection has alienated people regardless of political situation. But in areas of conflict and of military and political occupation, populations are even more at risk. On today's show, we explore life under the pandemic in one conflict area, the contested provinces of Jammu and Kashmir in India. Our guest is Mona Bhan, Ford Maxwell Professor of South Asian Studies and Associate Professor of Anthropology at Syracuse University. She is the author of Counterinsurgency, Development, and the Politics of Identity, From Warfare to Welfare, which examines the relationship between everyday forms of militarization and social life in Kashmir. Professor Bhan, my first question to you is, what exactly is the status of Kashmir? Is it under occupation? Who controls it, etc.?
I have been working in the part of Kashmir that is under Indian occupation, and that's what I'll be mostly focused on today. So to preface, the story of COVID and how it's impacted populations or worsened their state under military siege, I do want to maybe start from August 5th of last year, 2019, when the right-wing Hindu supremacist government under Narendra Modi, belongs to the Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP, initiated a multi-pronged military assault for the final and complete annexation of the portion of Kashmir which is occupied by India. Now, just to, again, track it back a little bit and to recognize that the word annexation, of course, is also used historically for the political condition in Kashmir because from 1947 onwards, for Kashmiris, they have been living under an active military occupation. And that is so because when India got its independence in 1947 from the British, Kashmir was a princely state at the time, a Muslim majority state governed by a Hindu monarch. And India's condition at the time, because of the ongoing political uncertainty, war, and post-colonial border making, what the king had to do was provisionally accede to India at the time. And I can go into details perhaps later if we have time. But it was a provisional accession of Kashmir with India. It was not a full and final accession. And the condition, of course, was that eventually the people of Kashmir would be able to exercise the UN-mandated right to self-determination to figure out what they wanted to do politically, what side they wanted to be on, and so on and so forth. So at the time, because of certain, again, ongoing political uncertainties, and because of this provisional accession, a very important constitutional provision called Article 370 and Article 335A. There were two constitutional provisions that were included in the Indian Constitution to mark Kashmir's conditional and provisional accession to India. Well, again, let me reiterate, this was conditional, this was provisional. So what 370 essentially did was preserve to an extent Kashmir's semi-autonomous status within the Indian Constitution, which meant that Kashmir, of course, could have its own flag, which it did until last year when 370 was abrogated. That is the story I'm trying to tell you, is the story of 370's abrogation on August 5th of last year. So Kashmiris had a separate flag. They had a separate constitution. They were the ones who could decide questions of citizenship and belonging and property rights and so on and so forth. All of that was to a large extent determined by the J&K or Jammu and Kashmir Constituent Assembly. Now, what the Indian government did on August 5th of last year was abrogate Article 370 and Article 35A, both of which, as I said, lent a degree of autonomy to Kashmiri state within the Indian Union. Now, the way this abrogation happened is also something that is very important to understand the ongoing COVID story in Kashmir, because according to many constitutional experts, this abrogation was deceitful. It was done unilaterally without taking into account people's aspirations or their wishes. In fact, on the contrary, there was an immediate militarized lockdown that was imposed on Kashmir. There was a total unprecedented communications blackout, which means people weren't able to make phone calls. I have family there. We weren't able to get in touch with them for months on end. There was no internet. People couldn't access cable TV. There were no newspapers being published. There was like this complete suppression of this fundamental right to express and speak and communicate even. So that, as I said, that was imposed on August 5th of last year. And in fact, it's a lockdown that has continued since under different iterations, right? So from March onwards, now if you see what's been happening in India, Modi imposed a massive, again, sort of overnight lockdown that terribly impacted particularly the lower classes of India, migrant laborers in particular. And you might have heard stories about that. But for Kashmiris, in some ways, the lockdown was nothing unique. They had already been living in a lockdown. So it was this lockdown in a lockdown situation, sustained lockdown, where time just had stopped, literally, right? It was a static notion of time that one day passes into the next, but people can't really track or keep track of what day is what they're supposed to do with time and space and so on and so forth. So all of that, right, this kind of deep sense of siege that Kashmiris had been living in has only intensified, I would argue, with the most recent interventions of the Modi government, at the behest now of a public health intervention. But I can go on and on. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about what this public health intervention does, or how it sort of pans itself out, and how this is really part of India's counterinsurgency toolkit yet again.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know, part of what you're describing is that there's been this pattern where India's relationship with Kashmir has changed over the course of the last, particularly about a year or so ago, because it was last August, that they had changed the constitutional status that you had described. And so this ongoing pattern of Indian military presence, which has always been in Kashmir, but has intensified over the course of the last year. But you mentioned counterinsurgency, because I know the context that the Indian government has stated as the justification for these actions was an increase of violence coming out of the region, including the killing of Indian soldiers, and there were military exchanges between India and Pakistan. So are you asserting they're using the pandemic as a justification to continue this practice, or is it just because, India has locked down all throughout the country and have had these really aggressive steps towards dealing with the pandemic, which certainly mirrors what they had been doing in Kashmir prior to March, prior to the pandemic's outbreak?
Thanks, Doug. Actually, I would argue it's not necessarily business as usual continuity. It is, in fact, a rupture of some kind, because it's not so much that what the Indian government is doing is just stabilizing, right? It's counterinsurgency interventions in Kashmir or perfecting them even more. It's worse than that. So under this current lockdown, again, at the behest of a public health crisis, there are some deep-rooted legal changes that are being introduced, apart from the abrogation of 35A and 370 that happened last year. On April 1st of this year, soon after actually the lockdown, the BJP government passed certain new domicile laws, which Kashmiris worry, and rightly so. They worry that these domicile laws, and I'll explain in a second what those are, that they really pave the way for India's settler colonial project in the region. And it's a Hindu settler colonial project. Again, to remind our audience that this is a Muslim majority region, the only Muslim majority region in that part of the world, in India. And the attempt here by the right-wing Hindu supremacist government is to, open up the floodgates for outsiders, for non-Kashmiris to come in and settle down, buy property, and use whatever institutional rights or institutional privileges that were reserved for Kashmiris up until now because of 370, open the floodgates for that to Indians too. So for example, there are new categories of citizens now coming up in the region. So the idea is to make non-Kashmiris eligible for school admissions, for employment, people who've lived there for 15 years, non-Kashmiris who've lived there for 15 years, grant them citizenship, make them Kashmiri, people who've studied there for 7 years, grant them rights to be Kashmiri, and so on and so forth. And so far, thousands of people have already been issued these domicile certificates under a pandemic. And this is really, really important to recognize that, as I said earlier, what we're recognizing is an intensification of this war against Kashmiris. Certainly there are continuities, but there are ruptures and deep ones at that, both, instrumentalized through political and legal means. And domicile law becomes one way to do so.
You're listening to Scholar Circle. We're discussing the pandemic under occupation and the specific case of Jammu and Kashmir. One thing that certainly seems to have changed over the years in Kashmir was, for the longest time, this was an area that was described as Pakistan's demand that it had become a part of Pakistan. We call it irredentist movement. But I know that polls started really demonstrating about 10 years ago that Kashmiris had begun rejecting the idea of irredentism with Pakistan in favor of independence. Is this shift within Kashmir one of the motivations, do you think, why India has taken a more aggressive step towards the region?
I wish I could have a straight up response to this question. The political reality on the ground in Kashmir is way more complicated. And I would say this, and I say it with most candor, that what Kashmiris really want right now is a right to self-determination, right? We haven't been able to figure out what that actually looks like. It could potentially mean independence for large swaths of the population, or it could also potentially mean that some people generally want to be with Pakistan because Pakistan has been a political party to this international issue now for the longest time, for the last 50 years, more than 50 years, since 1947. So I think I kind of want to approach your question a bit differently and say that, every time Kashmiris have wanted their right to self-determination, there are a lot of left-leaning liberals also in India who are okay with Kashmiris exercising their right of self-determination if they only seek independence. The moment they say that there is perhaps a constituency in Kashmir who might want to align with Pakistan, there's suddenly this sort of a wall that is erected that comes up, and people don't want to recognize that aspiration as a legitimate one. Now, we don't know. I mean, this is a very premature question because I think for any movement to figure out, what that goal is, we also have to realize that India has left Kashmiris very little options to dialogue, to create this dialogue around what right of self-determination could potentially look like. So, for example, Kashmiri leaders, not just leaders who were client regimes, they've been in prison for a long time. They were in prison for a long time after August 5th. But I'm talking about leaders who stood for Kashmiri's right to self-determination. They have been imprisoned repeatedly, right? The leadership is being kind of decimated in Kashmir. And so to expect them to know exactly what people want and whether they're going to align with Pakistan or seek independence, I think those are important questions. But I think what we really need to stress on right now is how Kashmiris are being denied their right to self-determination, whatever that might lead to. I mean, we cannot let those responses cloud the fundamental right that a population has to determine their future. We're just giving them sort of, pick the right one. We can't. We can't do that. We can't do that. Especially, as I said, at a time when Kashmiris have been, their leadership is being decimated, imprisoned, silenced for years on end. Does that somehow respond to your question?
Absolutely. This question, similar in, other contested areas, like, for instance, in Palestine, that will give you the right to choose so long as you make the right choice. Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there any reporting coming out about the number of cases in the region? Is this a region that has suffered quite a bit as a result of the pandemic?
Yes, immensely, in fact. And that's, again, going back to the militarized lockdown of the last year, because a lot of people are now saying it very openly and saying it clearly, on social media, but also in other forms of media, that what this militarized lockdown did of the past year is minimize people's capacities, right? Institutional capacities, physical capacities, psychological capacities, social capacities to deal with a pandemic of this nature, right? And we still have a continued internet ban in Kashmir. Kashmiris are only able to access 2G internet, not 4G internet. And doctors are saying they're unable to download videos, important information, materials that they need to stay on top of recent research that's being done in this area. They're unable to meet with their patients, online. So the word decimation, I think, is important here. It is literally a decimation of people's capacities to fight against a virus of this kind, against a pandemic of this kind, within a militarized lockdown. And what's also been happening is, as I said, COVID is being used as a way to criminalize populations yet again. And the numbers are rising. It's at an alarming rate, I would argue. I mean, in the beginning, there was some sort of a pause or some kind of the number, because also there was no testing. There's no universal testing in India. So I really, of course, don't trust the numbers that are coming from India more broadly. But in Kashmir, the situation is worsening. Yesterday, I was talking to somebody from Kashmir, and in just the neighborhood that my family is in, they had recorded 100 infections. And this is like a upper middle class neighborhood of Kashmir, where people are generally slightly better off. So I just can't even imagine the state, public health state in this region, where, of course, there's so much pressure already on medical resources, on medical personnel, pressures of multiple kinds. There are doctors who can't even say that they don't have facilities because they're immediately criminalized. So it's also that situation where doctors without facilities cannot, of course, ask for rights and ask for things as citizens, because they're not citizens, they're repressed subjects.
Thank you very much. This is a reminder that pandemics do not exist, do not outbreak in isolation, that there are political contexts, social contexts, and challenges that the populations face. Thank you very much, Mona Bhan. Our guest has been Mona Bhan. She is the Ford Maxwell Professor of South Asian Studies and Associate Professor of Anthropology at Syracuse University. She is the author of Counterinsurgency, Development, and the Politics of Identity, From Warfare to Welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doug.